Hey everyone! In today's video we will be looking into the lives of 5 princesses whose stories were anything but fairy tales. From forced marriages and child loss to sickness and isolation, these women endured misery, duty and despair in ways history rarely highlights. So, let's uncover the darkest royal fates you've never heard of. For our first tale, we begin in 19th century Belgium. Princess Stephanie Clotilde was born on the 21st of May 1864 in the Palace of Laeken in the suburbs of Brussels in Belgium. Her father was Prince Leopold, heir to the Belgian throne, and the son of King Leopold I, the very first ruler of Belgium since its independence in 1831. Just a year and a half after her birth, her grandfather died, and her father became King Leopold II. To the world, he was revered as a powerful statesman who made Belgium matter on the global stage, despite its small size. He filled the country with grand palaces and majestic civic buildings, cementing his reputation as a visionary ruler. But behind the glittering facade of his reign, darkness lurked. Today, Leopold II's legacy is one of horror. He turned the Congo into a private fiefdom, ruling it with an iron fist and exploiting its people for profit. Under his reign, millions of Congolese were enslaved on the rubber plantations, suffering many atrocities. Tragically, these conditions combined with disease and famine led to a sharp decline in the Congolese population. So, Stephanie's family's wealth was made in part from Congolese blood money. Stephanie's mother was Marie Henriette of Austria, a member of the Royal House of Habsburg in Austria, a country which had ruled Belgium for most of the 18th century. She and Leopold had 4 children. Their first daughter, Louise, was born in 1858, followed by their only son Leopold in 1859. Nearly 5 years later, Stephanie was born, and 8 years after that, they had their youngest daughter, Clementine. Despite all these children, the Belgian royal family's domestic life was far from happy. Their parents' marriage had been a purely political arrangement, and they had completely different interests and personalities. Over time, tensions grew, and Queen Marie Henriette increasingly distanced herself from her husband, spending much of the 1870s apart from him. This increased the rigid constraints of royal life, and in the coming years, Stephanie was about to be swept into a far darker world than she could have ever imagined. Stephanie's early years were marked by tragedy. In January 1869, her world was shattered when her brother, the heir to the throne, passed away, plunging the royal household into mourning. Although just 4.5 years old, this tragedy left a deep mark on Stephanie and began the decline of her parents' marriage. Then, in 1871, disaster struck again. Europe was still battling waves of deadly disease, typhus, smallpox, and the dreaded Blue Death, a nickname for cholera. And it wasn't long until an outbreak swept through Brussels. Stephanie, not yet 7, fell gravely ill with typhus. For weeks, she drifted between life and death, unconscious, feverish, and full of pain. Her family feared for the worst, but against all odds, she survived. 3 years later, Stephanie's rigorous education began. She was taught a variety of subjects to a high level and was multilingual, though she was not coddled, and she and her sisters were taught by strict disciplinarians. From 1875 onward, Stephanie often found herself as the highest-ranking female royal at court. Her older sister Louise had married and left Brussels, while her mother was frequently absent from the capital. Then, in the winter of 1878, her fate was sealed. Barely a teenager, she was introduced to Crown Prince Rudolph of Austria, the only son of Emperor Franz Joseph and heir to the vast Austro-Hungarian Empire. Rudolph was 20 while Stephanie was just 14, but their meeting was no accident. This was a match in the making. Behind the scenes, negotiations were in full swing. The Austrians saw Stephanie as a suitable bride, one who could secure the succession by producing male heirs. The pressure was immense, and after prolonged discussions, the marriage was arranged. On May 10, 1881, just days before her 17th birthday, Stephanie and Rudolf were wed in a grand ceremony in Vienna. But beneath the glittering spectacle of royalty, dark clouds were already forming over their union. Married life was far from a fairy tale for Stephanie. There was no great love, no deep affection, only duty. At first, their relationship was cordial, even somewhat happy, but cracks soon appeared. Rudolf had a volatile personality, and Stephanie found herself trapped in the palace, constantly watched, with little freedom. Despite the strain, the marriage produced a daughter named Elizabeth Marie, born in September 1883. But instead of joy, Rudolf met the news with thinly veiled disappointment. Well, he had wanted a male heir for the empire. She would be their only child, and Stephanie's only offspring. By the mid-1880s, she was sterile. The cause? Her own husband. Rudolf was not just an alcoholic, but a rampant philanderer, indulging in affairs with women across Vienna. He contracted numerous sexually transmitted diseases, and most historians agree that he likely passed both syphilis and gonorrhea to Stephanie, leaving her unable to have children at just 22. At first, doctors blamed peritonitis. Rudolf had kept his illness a secret, and by the time Stephanie learned the truth, it was too late. Betrayed and humiliated, she was consumed by resentment. She refused to share a bed with a husband who stumbled home at dawn, reeking of liquor and other women. Meanwhile, Rudolf, drowning in his own misery, spiraled deeper into debauchery. By the late 1880s, it was common knowledge at court that Stephanie would never have another child. Rudolf's affairs carried on as if nothing had changed, and the worst was yet to come. From among Rudolf's many mistresses, one became very prominent. This was Baroness Margarita. In 1888, at just 17 years old, she became involved with the 30-year-old Crown Prince. During this time, Rudolf's behaviour grew even more erratic, possibly due to his worsening syphilis. He and Versailles began spending much of their time at Mayerling, a secluded hunting lodge near Vienna that Rudolf had bought and turned into a private retreat from the imperial court. On the 30th of January 1889, Stephanie received shocking news. That morning, her husband, Crown Prince Rudolf, and Mary Versailles were found dead at Mayerling. The Mayerling incident, as it has become known, led to an investigation, and rumours of conspiracy, assassination, and even political intrigue swirled for years. But in the end, the truth was grim. Rudolf shot his mistress, and then took his own life. Thus, at just 24 years old, Stephanie was a widow and unable to have any further children. Curiously, in the letter which he left for her, Rudolf expressed some affection, though there is no doubt that his impact on her life was terrible in many ways. After Rudolf's death, Stephanie hoped to return home to Belgium, but there was one problem: her daughter. Elizabeth Marie was still a Habsburg princess, and the imperial court refused to let her leave Vienna. Stephanie, now the dowager crown princess, was stuck in a city where she was unwanted. Her in-laws turned their backs on her and viewed her presence as a painful reminder of what had happened with Rudolf. During this lonely time, she found comfort in a romance with Count Artur Podolski, a Polish nobleman who had stood by her through the darkest days. But fate struck again. Podolski, still under 40, suffered from laryngeal cancer. A failed surgery left him unable to speak, and by March 1890, he was dead. Stephanie, still grieving Rudolf's violent end, was once again plunged into mourning. To escape her sorrows, she travelled extensively, drifting through the Mediterranean, Malta, Tunisia, Sicily, Corfu and beyond, searching for distraction, relief, or perhaps a new beginning. Still young and able to remarry, King Leopold II had grand plans. He wanted Stephanie to marry the new heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. But that match never happened. Instead, by the late 1890s, Stephanie found love with Count Elemér Lunyoy, a Hungarian aristocrat. This was no political alliance. This was a marriage of affection, and Elemér even converted to Roman Catholicism, hoping to win King Leopold's approval. It didn't work. In a fierce letter, her father flatly refused to sanction the marriage. He would not allow his daughter to marry beneath her station. Despite this, Stephanie defied her father, and on March 22, 1900, she married Elemér at Miramar Castle near Trieste, losing her imperial titles in the process. Throughout these years, continued family disputes were emerging. Back in Belgium, Stephanie's father was growing old, and without a surviving direct male heir, plans were put in place for his nephew, Prince Albert, to succeed as King Albert I. Leopold had long been furious with his daughters for marrying beneath their station, and had all but disowned them. His resentment ran so deep that he forbade Stephanie from attending her mother's funeral in 1902, and refused to see her before his death. After Leopold's death in 1909, his daughters expected to inherit a share of his immense fortune. Instead, they discovered something quite shocking. He left most of his wealth to Caroline Lacroix, his much younger mistress, whom he had secretly married just 5 days before his death. Enraged, Stephanie and her sisters launched a fierce legal battle that dragged on for 5 years. In the end, Stephanie managed to secure a settlement of 5 million francs. In the summer of 1914, while on a state visit to Sarajevo, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the man Stephanie's father once hoped she would marry, was assassinated by a Serb nationalist, Gavrilo Princip. His death triggered a crisis that quickly spiraled into the First World War. Just weeks later, Germany invaded Belgium, despite its neutrality, and Stephanie's homeland remained under German occupation for the next 4 years. As Austria-Hungary was allied with Germany in the war, Stephanie found herself in an uncomfortable position, living in the empire that was helping to occupy her homeland. Moreover, she'd become convinced that Emperor Franz Joseph had been in some way involved in the assassination of his heir, Franz Ferdinand. Luckily, by then, she and Elemér were far from Vienna. In 1906, they'd settled at Rusovce Mansion, in what is now Slovakia, one of the few places untouched by the war. There, Stephanie dedicated herself to charitable work, finding purpose in a world unravelling around her. When Emperor Franz Joseph died in 1916, Stephanie and Elemér returned to Vienna for both his funeral and the coronation celebrations of the new ruler. Just 2 months later, Elemér was made a prince within the Hungarian aristocracy. But their world soon crumbled. In October 1918, Austria-Hungary lost the war and collapsed into separate nations. While most Habsburg royals were exiled, Stephanie and Elemér were spared. They remained at Rusovce Mansion, though they continued to travel frequently, and had a happy union. Stephanie and Elemér lived a quiet life after the First World War. By then she was also a grandmother, as her daughter had given birth to several children in the early 1900s. However, the relationship between Stephanie and her daughter became strained in the early 1920s. This was on account of Elizabeth Marie's personal life and her politics. She was a socialist and became known in Austria as the Red Archduchess. After a final falling out in 1924, Stephanie and her daughter Elizabeth Marie seemed to have cut ties completely, never speaking again. During these years, Stephanie composed her memoirs, published in 1935 and in English in 1937 under the title I Was to be Empress. However, it was not a full autobiography, as she barely mentioned the half-century that followed Rudolph's death. Instead, the book was divided into 4 parts, with the final section titled Tragedy at Mayerling. It was clear that her story, at least the one she chose to tell, ended in 1889. Perhaps her publishers knew that this was the version readers wanted, or maybe she simply didn't want to share the details of her private life since that fateful day. In September 1939, the Second World War broke out. Stephanie and her husband didn't live near the front lines, and the bordering countries were spared the worst of the fighting. Yet, towards the end of it, the couple were troubled by plans the Nazis drew up to convert Versailles into a field hospital as the Soviet Red Army advanced into Central Europe. When the Russians arrived there in the late spring of 1945, Stephanie and Eleme took refuge at the Pannonhalma Arch Abbey. She died there on the 23rd of August 1945 at 81 years of age. She had disinherited her daughter a year earlier, and Elizabeth Marie did not attend Stephanie's funeral. She was buried in the Arch Abbey's crypt, and Eleme, who died just under a year later, was buried next to her. Next, we journey back to 17th century Spain, where a delicate young princess was pushed into an uncle marriage and suffered the consequences. Infanta Margarita Theresa, or Margaret Theresa in English, was born in the Royal Alcazar Palace in Madrid on the 12th of July 1651. Her father was King Philip IV. He had been the ruler of Spain since 1621, after ascending to the throne when he was just 15 years old. Philip was known as Rey Planeta, which means the Planet King. This was because Spain's empire stretched around the world by then, covering most of Central and South America, the larger islands of the Caribbean, the Philippines and Asia, and some small parts of the coast of Western Africa. Margaret's mother was Mariana or Maria Anna of Austria, a daughter of Ferdinand III, Duke of Austria, and Holy Roman Emperor. Both of her parents were born into the mighty House of Habsburg, a dynasty that rose from the rugged borderlands of Switzerland and Austria in medieval times. As the years passed, the Habsburgs began to conquer much of Europe, but not primarily through bloody wars, no. Well, they had mastered the art of marriage as power, forging alliances that allowed them to seize vast empires. By the late 15th century, they inherited the Spanish throne, becoming Europe's most unstoppable force, a family whose power knew no limits. The Habsburgs weren't just known for their vast empire, they were infamous for their dangerous obsession with inbreeding. Generation after generation, they married within their own bloodline, sealing alliances at the cost of their own health. This twisted tradition would lead to devastating genetic consequences, crippling their dynasty from within. Margaret Theresa's parents weren't just distant relatives, they were far closer than anyone should be. Her father was from the Spanish branch of the family, her mother from the Austrian side, but their connection ran much deeper, because, in a shocking display of royal inbreeding, they were uncle and niece. The disturbingly close blood ties between Margaret's parents came at a cost. Of their 5 children, 3 died in infancy. Only 2 survived, Margaret and her younger brother Carlos, known as Charles in English. But survival didn't mean salvation. Charles was a walking testament to the horrors of inbreeding. By his 20s, he was prematurely aged, balding, and plagued by a grotesquely deformed jaw. His mind seemed to wither just as fast as his body, showing signs of early dementia. He was later nicknamed by contemporaries the Bewitched, as many believed his physical and intellectual issues were the result of sorcery. In fact, Margaret and Charles's inbreeding coefficient was grotesquely high, with some estimates suggesting they were as inbred as children born to siblings. To this day, Historians debate whether Charles's condition was purely genetic, the tragic result of centuries of unchecked inbreeding, or something else. Margaret may have been luckier, but she wasn't completely unaffected. Though much healthier than her brother, she carried the Habsburg curse in her own way, as we will see. Margaret was raised in the grandeur of the Royal Alcazar Palace, a world of opulence where every whim was catered to by an army of maids and servants. For example, the Infanta frequently indulged in sweets and chocolates, which she had to hide from the court physicians. Yet, beneath the luxury lay the suffocating constraints of the Madrid court, where every movement, every word, every glance was dictated by unyielding royal etiquette. As a princess of the mighty Habsburg dynasty, she received the finest education money and power could provide. She was taught multiple languages, versing herself in German to better converse with her Habsburg cousins from the Austrian side of the family, and learned some Latin, the sacred language of scholarship and the Roman Catholic Church. But no education could prepare her for the fate that awaited her. As Margaret grew older, she couldn't ignore the glaring age gap between her parents. Well, her father was nearly 30 years older than her mother. But if that detail disturbed her, she never showed it. Age differences aside, her parents adored her. She was their prized jewel, the only truly healthy child their union had produced, and they showered her with affection. With her delicate features and lively spirit, Margaret captivated those around her. She was their little angel, a nickname whispered with adoration by family and friends alike. Perhaps that's why her parents commissioned one of Europe's greatest painters to immortalize her in a stunning portrait when she was just 5 years old. A portrait that would become one of the most famous paintings in history. Velázquez's painting was once known as La Familia, the family. Today it is called Las Meninas, which means the ladies in waiting. This is a more appropriate title, as it depicts Margaret being waited on by several household staff who are fixing her dress. Among the many figures captured in the painting, another stands out, Marie Barbola, a courtier with dwarfism. In an era when those with her condition were often reduced to mere entertainment for the nobility, Velázquez did something radical. Instead of simply portraying her as a joke, he gave her depth, dignity, and a piercing gaze that suggests a complex inner world. Even Velázquez himself appears in the masterpiece, a silent observer of the lavish yet rigid world of the Spanish court. Other people are seen in paintings and mirrors in Las Meninas, including Margaret's parents. And this wasn't the only famous painting of Margaret either. Velázquez painted no less than 5 portraits of the princess in her youth, immortalizing her prettiness and royal elegance. In fact, she was one of the most painted young people in all of early modern Europe, crafting her image of power and prestige, though this would contrast with the sad destiny that awaited her. It might seem hard to fathom to modern minds, but by the time Las Meninas was painted in 1656, when Margaret was just 5 years old, there was already a growing discussion at the Spanish court about who she would marry. In the ruthless world of royal politics, marriage was never about love, it was about power. Emotions and personal desires meant nothing when dynasties were at stake. As the daughter of the King of Spain, Margaret wasn't just a princess, she was a high-stakes chess piece in the brutal game of European diplomacy, her future decided long before she even understood it. For instance, at one point there was a suggestion that she could marry Charles Stuart of the English royal family. He was restored to the English throne as King Charles II of England, Scotland and Ireland in 1660, after England had briefly experimented with being a republic in the 1650s. A marriage of this kind would have been used to form an unlikely alliance with the English, at a time when France and Spain were bitter rivals for dominance of Western Europe. In the end, Charles instead married Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese bride in 1662. The collapse of negotiations for Margaret to marry Charles Stuart was primarily owing to King Philip's opposition. Instead, he believed that his daughter should marry a member of the Austrian side of the Habsburg family. He seemed to show no concern whatsoever that this marriage would deepen the family's inbreeding. After all, it was simply how the Habsburgs kept power in their grip. As for Margaret, she had no say in her fate. When negotiations between Madrid and Vienna began, she was likely blissfully unaware of the shocking consequences this union would bring. She was still just 11 years old when it was announced at the royal court that she would marry Leopold of the House of Habsburg. Like her mother before her, Margaret was now destined to continue the incestuous Habsburg tradition and was going to marry a very close family member, a man who was both her first cousin and her uncle. Leopold was her mother's younger brother and had succeeded to become Archduke of Austria, King of Hungary, Croatia and Bohemia, and the Holy Roman Emperor in quick succession in the late 1650s. Even in early modern Europe, there were some standards around when a child was old enough to marry. Margaret was betrothed to her uncle early in 1663, but she was deemed to be too young for the marriage to take place at that time. Instead, it was not until April 1666, by which time she was nearing her 15th birthday, that Margaret set off from Madrid to travel to Vienna. A 6-month tour followed, and the Spanish royal party only arrived in Vienna in December 1666. The marriage ceremony took place a few days later, on the 12th of December. It was a magnificent event, attended by many of Europe's most powerful royals and dignitaries, with no expense spared. And the grandeur didn't end there. Celebrations raged on throughout 1667. Yet, behind the splendour, a dark fate was already unfolding. Life in Vienna was peculiar and sometimes difficult for Margaret. To begin with, she and her new husband had a strange marriage. It might surprise modern ears to hear this, but they didn't try to ignore their close blood relationship. She actually called him uncle. Despite this unorthodox situation, they did get along. They enjoyed some of the same pursuits, including art and music, and Leopold did his best to make sure Margaret was comfortable in her new surroundings. It was also common for royals like Margaret, when they left their homeland to go and marry a foreign ruler or prince, to bring along members of their old household staff. So she would have had some familiar faces around her at the court in Vienna as she acclimatized to her new life. Perhaps there were even some of the people who had been there in Madrid when Velázquez was painting Las Meninas many years earlier. Despite this, Margaret remained deeply homesick, clinging to her Spanish roots and doing little to improve her German. As time passed, her once delicate beauty began to fade. Her complexion grew paler, her features more fatigued, and the characteristic Habsburg jaw became more pronounced. The marriage was troubled in other ways too. Margaret became pregnant almost immediately after arriving in Vienna, and gave birth to a boy named Ferdinand in September 1667. He only survived for 3.5 months though, and died in January 1668. Their luck seemed to change with the birth of their next child, a daughter, Maria Antonia, born in January 1669. She would be the only one of Margaret's children to survive. 2 others were not so fortunate. A son, John Leopold, was born on the 20th of February 1670, but tragically died within hours. Another daughter, Maria Anna, lived just 2 weeks before passing away in February 1672. And this devastating pattern was a sign of things to come. Margaret's difficult series of pregnancies were partly owing to her own health problems. Although she had been a much healthier child than her brother, she did have some growing health issues in the years leading up to and following her arrival in Vienna. When she arrived to the Austrian capital late in 1666, people there quickly began commenting on her frequent illnesses. For a time, Many observers put this down to the constant strain of pregnancy. In just 6 years, she endured 6 pregnancies, including 4 live births and 2 miscarriages, each leaving her weaker and more depressed than before. But as time passed, it became clear that something more sinister was at play. Margaret was often confined to her bed, even when she wasn't pregnant. Physicians diagnosed her with an enlarged thyroid gland, but in the 17th century, there was no cure, and her condition only worsened. Things really went downhill for Margaret in the early spring of 1673. She had a 3-week-long attack of stomach pains. Then she developed a fever. There are documents that were written by foreign ambassadors at the court at Vienna at this time, which indicate that many were seriously concerned that she would die. By early March, she had difficulties breathing, and on the 10th of March a confessor was called in to hear her last confession and give her the sacrament. Just 2 days later, on March 12th, Margaret died at the tender age of 21. An autopsy revealed a heartbreaking truth. She was carrying another baby boy at the time of her death. Her life, cut tragically short, ended in the imperial crypt in Vienna, where she was laid to rest. The death of the Archduchess and Holy Roman Empress resulted in a lengthy mourning period at the Austrian court. The funeral services stretched on for weeks into April. Leopold was devastated by his wife's untimely death. However, this didn't stop him marrying again by the end of the year. His new wife was Archduchess Claudia Felicitas of Austria, a member of the Tyrolese branch of the Habsburgs. But for Leopold, the marriage wasn't about love, it was about survival. The dynastic game had to continue, and more heirs were desperately needed, preferably male, to ensure the Habsburgs' reign could endure. After Margaret's death, her rights to the Spanish throne were passed to her only surviving daughter, Maria Antonia. When Maria Antonia herself died in 1692, her rights were inherited by her only surviving son, Prince Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria. However, Joseph Ferdinand's untimely death in 1699, coupled with King Charles II's failure to produce an heir, would trigger a succession crisis that plunged Spain and all of Europe into a brutal war that lasted nearly 15 years. A crisis that perhaps could have been avoided if the Habsburgs hadn't destroyed themselves from within due to their incestuous practices. We are staying in the 17th century for our next story, to look at a princess who hated her life once she became queen. Maria Theresa of Spain was born on the 10th of September 1638 at the Escorial Palace outside Madrid. Her father was Philip IV, King of Spain since 1621 and ruler of the largest colonial empire ever seen in history up to that time, stretching from Mexico in the north, south to Chile and Argentina. Her mother was Elizabeth of France, a daughter of King Henry IV of France, and a brother of King Louis XIII, the ruler of France at the time of Maria Theresa's birth. Maria Theresa's parents had many children, but tragically nearly all of them died in infancy. Only one of her 4 siblings, Balthasar Charles, lived beyond infancy, but he too was taken too soon. In 1644, when Maria Theresa was just 6 years old, her mother Elizabeth died from complications after another miscarriage. Then, 2 years later, her older brother, aged just 16 years old, also passed away. This loss carved out a deep void in the young Infanta's heart, and with her brother's death, she suddenly became the heir to the Spanish throne. After the deaths of her mother and brother, the young Infanta drew closer to her father, who ensured she received a strict Catholic counter-Reformation education. Taught by distinguished scholars, she studied Latin and other subjects, while her father personally introduced her to politics and history. Yet her upbringing was not without warmth. She was surrounded by pets, entertainers, and the splendour of the Spanish court. This court, one of the most magnificent in the world, was enriched by wealth from the Americas and graced by cultural figures such as the painter Diego Velázquez, providing Maria Theresa with an extraordinary environment in which to grow. Yet Philip understood that no matter how well educated, a daughter as sole heir could ignite unrest and threaten the very stability of the monarchy. Because of this, in 1649, he remarried, this time to his own niece, 14-year-old Mariana of Austria. She gave birth to 2 sons, one of which, Charles or Carlos, born in 1661, would live into adulthood. This half-brother replaced Maria Theresa as the direct heir to their father and would succeed as King Carlos II in 1665. To understand the way in which Infanta Maria Theresa's life would play out, we need to understand the horrendous diplomatic relationship between Spain and France in the early modern era. Both France and Spain only began to take shape as unified kingdoms in the 15th century. Before this, Spain was divided into realms such as Castile, Leon and Aragon, while France was emerging from feudal fragmentation and the 100 Years' War. With consolidation, they rose to become the most powerful kingdoms in Western Europe. In 1494, France invaded the Italian peninsula, where Spain held extensive territories in the south. This sparked a bitter rivalry between the two powers that raged for more than 150 years. Spain and France were locked in the Italian wars for 65 years, ending in 1559 with Spain victorious and dominant in Italy, ruling Sardinia, Sicily, Naples and Milan. Soon after, France was torn apart by its wars of religion, during which Spain intervened on behalf of the Catholic League, sending troops into France in the 1580s and 1590s. After peace returned in 1598, a brief pause followed before the two powers clashed again, this time on opposite sides of the 30 Years' War that broke out in 1618. During this, their rivalry extended into northern Italy, over the Duchy of Mantua, and into Spain's own territories as France supported rebellions in Portugal and Catalonia in the 1640s. In many ways, the Franco-Spanish rivalry defined Western Europe's international politics from the 1490s until the 1650s. That is, until Maria Theresa's marriage to Louis XIV was organised. The conflict between France and Spain was so bitter that even after the rest of Europe's major powers made peace with one another and ended the 30 Years' War in 1648, the French and Spanish kept fighting. But by the 1650s, the Spanish were worn out. They lost control of Portugal, which they had acquired at the end of the 1590s, and which now once again became an independent nation, and they only barely quelled the rebellion in Catalonia. Thus, on the 7th of November 1659, they agreed to the Treaty of the Pyrenees with France, which was signed on the mountain border between the two nations. Under the terms of the treaty, Spain would cede territory in the Spanish Netherlands to the French, and there was also a marriage alliance put in place to cement the new peace. Under the terms, Philip IV agreed to marry his daughter Maria Theresa to the King of France, Louis XIV. The idea was that after 165 years of almost constant war between the French and the Spanish, the marriage alliance would lead to a more lasting peace. Spain in particular needed such an arrangement, as their coffers were empty, and they were a declining power as a result of the costly wars which they'd fought perpetually throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. Although the Treaty of the Pyrenees was agreed to in November 1659, the formal signing and meeting between the two monarchs occurred on the 7th of June 1660. Maria Theresa accompanied her father and a large entourage of Spanish courtiers and ministers who headed to the Pyrenees to sign the treaty there on the island of Pheasants, a tiny island on the river of Bidasoa on the border. There she met her future husband, who was already signalling his intent to rule as an absolutist monarch, rejecting reliance on Parliament and presenting himself as God's chosen representative to govern France. When Louis first saw his future bride, he would have noticed a small, plump woman with fair skin and blonde hair, well within the beauty standards of the time. Unlike many Habsburgs, she had not inherited the pronounced facial features caused by generations of inbreeding, thanks mainly to her mother. However, she did have poor teeth, a result of her love for sweets and hot chocolate. Curiously, the pair, both 21 years old, were nearly the exact same age. Louis was born on September 5th, 1638, just 5 days before Maria Theresa. By the time they met, Louis had already been King of France for 17 years, having inherited the throne in 1643, when he wasn't even 5. After the meeting on the Island of Pheasants, the betrothed couple crossed the border. There, Maria Theresa bid her father a final, heartbreaking farewell, both aware they would never meet again. In parting, Philip IV reminded his daughter of her new destiny. "You must forget that you are an Infanta, and remember only that you are Queen of France." On the 9th of June 1660, they married at the small town of Saint-Jean-de-Luz in French territory, making Maria Theresa Queen Consort of France. They then progressed north slowly over the summer and only made their ceremonial entry into Paris on the 26th of August 1660, during which the people of the French capital turned out in great numbers to welcome their new queen. A strange element of Maria Theresa's marriage which should be noted is that she was marrying her double first cousin. Despite the hostile relationship between France and Spain over the years, the pair were closely related. Louis's mother was Anne of Austria. Anne's father was Philip III of Spain, Maria Theresa's grandfather. Moreover, because of the severe inbreeding between the Spanish and Austrian royal houses, two separate branches of the House of Habsburg, Maria Theresa was related to Louis in other tangled ways. To compound matters, on her direct family side, Maria Theresa's mother Elizabeth was Louis XIV's aunt. So, both were the product of Europe's royal inbreeding, and this incestuous union would only further it. Luckily though, their children escaped the crippling inbreeding that plagued other Spanish and Austrian Habsburgs, but it may have affected them in other ways, as we shall see. Maria Theresa became pregnant for the first time within a few months of marrying Louis. On the 1st of November 1661, less than 17 months after their wedding, she gave birth to their first child, a boy who they named Louis after his father. He would live a reasonably healthy and long life. Maria Theresa was not so lucky with her subsequent children though. Two daughters, Anne Elizabeth and Marie Anne, were born in November 1662 and November 1664. In a tragic coincidence, both died after 6 weeks in late December 1662 and late December 1664. A third child, christened as Marie-Thérèse after her mother, lived until she was 5 years old, but she too was claimed in March 1672 from what is believed to have been tuberculosis. Two further sons, Philippe Charles and Louis François, were born in 1668 and 1672, and both also died in infancy. Therefore, of the 6 children Maria Theresa gave birth to, only one, her firstborn, survived to become an adult. While high infant mortality was common in the 17th century, as seen even in Queen Anne of Great Britain's tragic experiences, Maria Theresa's losses were especially severe. Her children's frailty may have been owed not only to the era's medical limits, but also to her deeply inbred lineage and her marriage to a double first cousin, which compounded those hereditary weaknesses. Maria Theresa's reign as Queen Consort of France was a peculiar one. She was well liked by her husband and the court, and was described as charitable, superstitious, and devotedly in love with her husband. She did everything she could to please him, adopting the fashions of the French court, and participating in balls and spectacles despite her natural shyness. She spent her free time surrounded by her ladies-in-waiting from Spain, her dwarves, her little dogs, and her beloved chocolate. She was also known to frequently wear high heels to compensate for her small stature, but she was clumsy and often fell over. Yet, her devotion was tested daily. Louis, a serial philanderer, maintained a string of mistresses both in Paris and later at the newly built Palace of Versailles. Maria Theresa despised many of these, and she often wept in private, but she turned a careful blind eye never publicly confronting him. To try and make up in part for his infidelities, Louis frequently staged performances of comedy, particularly Spanish comedy, which he knew she loved. Surrounded by a court full of French aristocrats, Maria Theresa formed a close bond with her mother-in-law, Anne of Austria, the widow of Louis XIII, and her Habsburg cousin. With Anne, Maria Theresa could speak Spanish, pray, visit churches, and perform charitable works away from the prying eyes of the French court. She affectionately called her Dia, but Anne's death in January 1666 was a devastating loss, removing a key ally and protector. After Anne's passing, Louis no longer bothered to hide his affairs, especially after falling under the spell of Madame de Montespan in the autumn of 1666. Beyond this, her primary role as queen consort was to try and mediate relations between France and Spain. Her husband was determined to expand his kingdom and ultimately aimed to extend the eastern border all the way to the River Rhine in the Netherlands and western Germany. This would necessarily bring France into conflict again with Spain, which still controlled the Spanish Netherlands, which basically overlapped with modern-day Belgium. The Spanish also controlled the Franche-Comté, or Free Country, in what is now eastern France. Maria Theresa was placed in a very difficult position in May 1667, when her husband went to war with her native country to try and claim these lands. The War of Devolution was ultimately a short conflict in which the French overran the Spanish Netherlands. By May 1668, peace terms were patched up whereby Spain ceded a large chunk of the Spanish Netherlands to France. The peace terms may have been even more punitive for the Spanish had Maria Theresa not been able to moderate her husband's demands. Maria Theresa would not live to be an elderly woman. In July 1683, she developed a severe abscess in her armpit. A fever then rose, and her physicians opted for the standard medical procedure at the time of bloodletting. The incision may have struck a large vein or artery, and she died from the procedure on the 30th of July at 44 years of age. Her last words were, "Since I have been queen, I have had only one happy day." Louis XIV soon married one of his long-standing mistresses in private, though the marriage was never made public, and they didn't have any legitimate children. This meant that Maria Theresa's sole surviving child remained the only heir to the throne. The Grand Dauphin, or Great Prince as he was known, lived down to 1711. However, he failed to outlive his own father, Louis XIV, who lived to 1715. In the end, when he died, it was a great-grandson of Maria Theresa, the Grand Dauphin's grandson, who succeeded as King Louis XV. The direct line of the Spanish royal family died out in 1700 when Maria Theresa's half-brother Carlos II died in his late 30s, in part owing to health complications brought about by severe inbreeding. When he passed away, Philip of Anjou, a son of the Grand Dauphin and grandson of Maria Theresa, succeeded as King Philip V of Spain. Thus, Maria Theresa's marriage to Louis XIV in 1660 not only helped cement peace between France and Spain, 40 years later, it saw a member of the French royal family succeed as King of Spain. For our fourth tale, we are going back to the mid-16th century. Anna of Austria was born on the 2nd of November 1549 at Cigales near Valladolid in Spain. Her father was the future Holy Roman Emperor, Maximilian II, a son of Ferdinand I, the Archduke of Austria and King of Hungary, Bohemia and Croatia, who became the Holy Roman Emperor in 1556. Maximilian would inherit his father's vast titles upon his death in 1564, cementing his place among Europe's most powerful rulers. Although Anna was from an Austrian family, she was born in Spain because of an extended visit to the country by her father, who in 1548 had married Maria, a daughter of none other than Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, King of Spain, and the most dominant monarch in all of Europe. As you might have suspected, Anna's parents were closely related. They were first cousins, as their fathers, Charles V and Ferdinand I, were brothers, both members of the illustrious House of Habsburg. Her parents' marriage marked one of the earliest intermarriages between the Austrian and Spanish branches of the Habsburg dynasty, an alliance forged for political strength, but one that would, over the following century, contribute to the genetic inbreeding that came to plague the family line. Anna spent her earliest years amid the splendour of the Spanish court, surrounded by ceremony, power, and the grandeur of empire. The eldest of 9 children who survived infancy, she quickly became her father's cherished favourite. During these years, her mother Maria governed Spain as regent alongside her new husband Maximilian, while her own father, the mighty Charles V, was occupied in Central Europe, waging his relentless campaign to suppress the Protestant Reformation in Germany. Maria's regency lasted until 1551, when her brother Prince Philip returned from Central Europe to assume control as acting ruler in their father's absence. With Philip now in charge, Anna's parents were free to return to Austria, where Anna was raised and educated amid the grandeur of Vienna throughout the 1550s. Though she was too young to remember her early years in Spain, those at court could never forget the imperial child who had been born among them, an infant princess, whose destiny was already entwined with the great powers of Europe. Before delving deeper into Anna's life and the strange, fateful marriage that would define it, we need to understand the turbulent world in which her story unfolded. 16th century Europe looked very different than today, with competing powers, shifting alliances, and dramatic politics. Germany was not yet a single nation, but a mix of hundreds of small states, duchies, and free cities under the loose framework of the Holy Roman Empire. To the east stretched the vast Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, while Italy was divided into dozens of rival states, including the Papal States, the Republic of Venice, and a host of other duchies constantly fighting for dominance. Amid this fragmented landscape, 2 titans stood out from the rest, the kingdoms of Spain and France. Locked in a bitter struggle for European supremacy, they had waged a relentless series of wars from 1494 to 1559 over control of Italy. For Spain, maintaining a close bond with the Austrian branch of the Habsburg family was vital in keeping French ambitions in check. By the late 1560s, this alliance had become more crucial than ever. A fierce revolt had erupted in the Low Countries around modern-day Belgium and the Netherlands, threatening Spanish control of one of its richest territories. As King Philip II sought to preserve this piece of his empire, he looked to strengthen his ties with his Austrian kin. And out of this web of dynastic necessity and political strategy would emerge the marriage that shaped Anna's destiny. Initially, Anna was never meant to marry Philip at all, so how did this come about? The Habsburg courts of Madrid and Vienna had a different union in mind, one that would strengthen family and empire alike. The plan was for Anna to wed her first cousin, Don Carlos, Prince of Asturias, the only son of King Philip II, and his first wife, Maria Manuela of Portugal. By the standards of royal Europe, such a match was hardly shocking. Marriages between cousins were common tools of diplomacy, designed to bind kingdoms together in loyalty and blood, a tradition that would persist in European royalty well into the 20th century. Don Carlos and Anna were even close in age, with Carlos only being 4 years her senior, a pairing that seemed, on paper at least, both politically and personally well matched. Anna, however, was far from Don Carlos's only prospect. As early as 1559, while Spain and France were negotiating to end the long Italian wars, plans were made for Carlos to marry a French princess. That same year, he became engaged to Elizabeth of Valois, the eldest daughter of King Henry II of France. Yet in a twist of dynastic diplomacy, Elizabeth was hastily married to Philip himself, as part of a broader effort to secure peace between the 2 rival kingdoms. 3 other brides were then proposed for the young prince, including another French candidate, but France soon descended into the wars of religion between Catholics and Protestants, causing those plans to collapse. By the mid-1560s, with foreign matches no longer viable, it was finally agreed that Don Carlos would marry his cousin Anna. All was not well in Spain though. While Anna grew into her teenage years in Vienna believing that she would marry her cousin in a few years' time, events hundreds of kilometers away were taking a darker turn. Don Carlos, once a promising heir, had been plagued by fevers and mysterious health problems since his mid-teens. Then, in 1562, he suffered a head injury after falling down a staircase, and despite a series of bizarre and often brutal medical treatments, his psychological state began to deteriorate. By the time he reached his 20s, Don Carlos was infamous for violent emotional outbursts, erratic behaviour, and alarming instability. His actions became ever more dangerous. He secretly reached out to opponents of his father's rule, including the Dutch rebels in the Low Countries. Alarmed by his reckless defiance, Philip II took drastic action and had his own son arrested in early 1568. With that, any hope of a marriage between Anna and Don Carlos was abruptly and irrevocably shattered. On the 24th of July 1568, Don Carlos died while imprisoned. To this day, suspicions linger on, with many believing his father starved him to death, determined to prevent his son from becoming a rallying point for rebellion. Yet while this disaster ended one potential union, it did not extinguish the idea of Anna marrying within her Habsburg family. Instead, the plan would take a dark and unexpected turn, setting the stage for one of the most extraordinary marriages of the era. When Don Carlos died in the summer of 1568, Philip II was a married man, though his current wife was his third. His first wife, Don Carlos's mother, Maria Manuela of Portugal, had died 4 days after giving birth to him from severe bleeding following labour. Philip's second wife, Mary Tudor, Queen of England and Ireland, had died from suspected stomach or uterine cancer in 1558, and they had no children. He then married Elizabeth of Valois, a French princess, in 1560. After a complex natal history, she died after a stillbirth on the 3rd of October 1568, 10 weeks after Don Carlos's death. All of this left Philip II in a desperate position. He had lost both his heir and his wife. His third marriage had produced only daughters, and with the deaths of Don Carlos and Elizabeth of Valois in quick succession, the king found himself without a male successor. And so, in a move that shocked Europe, Philip proposed the unthinkable. If Don Carlos could no longer marry Anna, then perhaps he himself should marry his niece. Astonishingly, Anna's father agreed. Thus, 20-year-old Anna married her 43-year-old uncle by proxy in May 1570, while she was still in Vienna, defying not only convention, but also the objections of Pope Pius V, who was appalled by Philip's plans to marry his niece. Until now, Anna's union with Philip had existed only on paper, married by proxy while she remained in Austria and he ruled from Spain. In the autumn of 1570, though, it was finally time for her to travel to the Iberian Peninsula, where a grand formal ceremony awaited. She travelled with a large retinue, a mix of familiar faces from Vienna who would now accompany her to Spain and remain by her side, a common practice among royal courts to provide continuity and comfort for brides whose lives were suddenly uprooted and sent to live in a foreign land. The journey to Spain was long and fraught with tension. Anna's party travelled overland through the Low Countries before taking a ship to the Iberian Peninsula. They were met with jeers and hostility from the Dutch along the way, an ominous start to a marriage that was already steeped in political intrigue. The voyage unfolded against the backdrop of the recently ignited Dutch revolt, which had erupted in 1568, after years of simmering unrest in the Spanish Habsburg territories. Along the way, the princess became embroiled in a diplomatic controversy when relatives of Floris of Montmorency, a Dutch noble imprisoned in Spain for his role in the revolt, petitioned Anna to intervene on his behalf. After weeks at sea, she arrived in Spain on the 3rd of October 1570 and formally requested that his life be spared. But before she could reach the king, Floris was secretly executed on October 16th, strangled to death, most historians believe, on Philip's orders. By all accounts, Anna settled into life in Spain surprisingly well. She was greeted by many who remembered her as an infant, and her presence brought a spark of life to the rigid and often solemn Spanish court. Bright, cheerful and vivacious, she eased some of the stifling formality that had long defined Philip's reign. Anna also became Philip's most beloved wife. Diplomats reported that the king was genuinely in love with his young wife, and unlike many of his predecessors, there are no records of him taking mistresses during their marriage. Philip was said to visit her bedchambers daily, and the couple were very close, and also had similar personalities. Soon she was pregnant, and in December 1571, the hoped-for son arrived. He was named Ferdinand after Anna's grandfather, and was given the title of Prince of Asturias, which Don Carlos had held until his suspicious death a few years earlier. However, he did not survive into adulthood. In October 1578, he died from a possible case of dysentery. Unfortunately, Ferdinand's fate set the pattern for Anna and Philip's future children. Another son named Carlos was born in 1573, but died less than 2 years later in 1575. Another boy named Diego was born in 1575. As Ferdinand was still alive at this time, this seemed to cement the succession, as there were briefly 2 healthy sons in line to the throne. But once Ferdinand died in 1578, Diego became the heir apparent. He would outlive his mother, though he too ultimately died young from smallpox in 1582. The couple's only daughter, named Maria and born in 1580, died in 1583. This meant that only one of their 5 children, a boy named Philip after his father, would survive into his adult years. He was born in 1578 and would become the heir that Philip II had wished for, even to the point of marrying his own niece. As mentioned, Philip and Anna had a very good relationship, despite their age difference and family ties, and she even acted as a loving mother to her stepdaughters from Philip's marriage to Elizabeth of Valois. However, Anna soon became the 4th of Philip's wives to die prematurely. In 1578, King Sebastian I of Portugal had died in North Africa while campaigning against the Muslims of Morocco. He was only 24 years old and did not have any children. He was briefly succeeded by Henry I of Portugal, but Henry was a cardinal of the church, who did not have any children either. When he died in 1580, a succession crisis ensued, and Philip claimed the throne of Portugal. This was disputed, and in order to solidify his claim, Philip, Anna, and the Spanish court set off for Portugal in September 1580. In theory, Anna was briefly Queen Consort of Portugal for a few weeks in the late autumn of 1580. It would be a short stint though. During the journey to Portugal, or after arriving there, she contracted an aggressive form of influenza and she became seriously ill. She died from the condition in the city of Badajoz on the 26th of October 1580, a week short of her 31st birthday. Although she was initially buried in Portugal, her remains were later taken back to Spain and interred in the royal crypt at the Escorial Palace. Her husband Philip would never remarry, and he lived down to 1598. Finally, we are travelling to Austria, to the early 16th century. Elizabeth of Austria of the House of Habsburg was born on the 9th of July 1526 in the city of Linz in Upper Austria. She was the first child of the marriage of Ferdinand I, Archduke of Austria, and Anna of Bohemia and Hungary. They had been married 5 years earlier, and there had been growing concern at the Habsburg court that Anna might not be able to have children. This would have been a problematic issue for any royal and aristocratic line in early modern Europe, a time when marriages were all about producing male heirs and daughters to form marital alliances with. Fortunately for the lonely young princess, Elizabeth's arrival seemed to open the floodgates of life within the imperial nursery. Soon, the couple's once quiet corridors rang with the cries of newborn princes and princesses. Archduchess Anna would go on to bear 15 children, a staggering number, and miraculously, most of them survived well into adulthood, defying the deadly odds of 16th century childhood. Young Elizabeth spent her childhood within the grand yet shadowed halls of the Hofburg Palace in Innsbruck. Surrounded by scholars, courtiers, and quiet intensity of a devout household, she was raised in an atmosphere where learning was both a privilege and a duty. Her parents, Ferdinand and Anna, were passionate about knowledge, ensuring that Elizabeth and her siblings were rigorously educated in languages, the arts, and the Catholic faith. She mastered German, Italian, and French, though curiously not Polish, a language that would have proved far more useful in her tragic future. Her days were filled with prayer, lessons, and the melodies of harpsichords, while her father's fiery devotion left no room for hearsay. When he discovered that one of her tutors had joked about the cardinals, he swore he'd see anyone spreading Lutheran ideas executed. Around the year 1530 or 1531, when Elizabeth was a child of 4 or 5 years, the Austrian court painter Jakob Seisenegger painted her portrait for the first time. The painting today shows a seemingly happy and healthy young girl with red cheeks and a gentle disposition. But all was not well with Elizabeth in her childhood years. As she grew up, she began to suffer from seizures, and these got worse and more frequent over time. The general understanding today is that Elizabeth was epileptic. This was a condition shrouded in mystery during the 16th century, a time when the medical revolution was only just beginning. Even so, there was a growing awareness, and at least they recognized that it was a health condition. Well, in past times, epilepsy had been treated as an almost supernatural condition. Depending on the time and place, it could actually be viewed negatively or positively. For instance, in some cultures it was considered a divine curse. In others, those with epilepsy were believed to be in communion with God or the gods during their seizures. The lack of medical knowledge about epilepsy in 16th century Europe would cast a long and haunting shadow over Elizabeth's life, because even though some did recognize this as a health condition, no one truly understood what was happening to her. As we will see, when Elizabeth journeyed to Poland as a young bride, her condition began to spiral out of control. Whispers filled the royal courts. Some claimed she was being poisoned on the secret commands of her spiteful and controlling mother-in-law. Others thought it was the devil's hand. But the truth was far more tragic. There was no poison, no plot, only a young queen's body betraying her, as her epilepsy quietly, relentlessly worsened. Before we follow Elizabeth on her fateful journey to Poland, we must first turn back the clock to the year 1526, the very year of her birth. Less than 2 months after she entered the world, the thunder of war erupted at Mohacs, a quiet plain in Hungary near the Danube River. On August 29, 1526, the Battle of Mohacs would become one of the most decisive clashes in European history. After more than 2 centuries of relentless expansion across the Near East, through Turkey, the Levant, Egypt, and deep into the Balkans, the Ottoman Empire now turned its gaze towards the heart of Central Europe. Sultan Suleiman I led a large army into Hungary and met a considerably smaller force led by King Louis II of Hungary and a confederacy of allies amongst the voivodes and lords of places like Transylvania and Wallachia. The battle not only ended in Turkish victory and a further expansion northwards, King Louis II was also killed during it. His death set off a succession dispute that shaped Elizabeth's life. Growing up as a child in Linz and Vienna, she would have been entirely unaware that this fateful battle 7 weeks after she was born had determined the course her life would take. King Louis II of Hungary was just 20 years of age when he died, and he did not have an heir. With his passing, the direct line of Jagiellon kings, who had ruled Hungary since the death of King Matthias Corvinus in 1490, came to an end. Moreover, Louis II had also been king of Croatia and Bohemia. While some of the lands he had ruled in name were now occupied by the Ottoman Turks, and would remain so for centuries in some cases, the price for who would succeed him was considerable. 3 different crowns, those of Hungary, Bohemia, and Croatia. There were 2 strong claimants to the throne. Elizabeth's father was one of them. Ferdinand's wife, Elizabeth's mother, was called Anna of Bohemia and Hungary for a reason. She was the sister of the now dead King Louis II, and the daughter of Vladislaus II, who had ruled Hungary, Bohemia, and Croatia down to his death in 1516. Through Anna, Ferdinand's children, including the infant Elizabeth, were the blood heirs of the Jagiellon dynasty, a living continuation of that royal line. His claim was not through conquest or politics alone, but through blood itself, a matrilineal bridge linking the Habsburgs to the vanquished crowns of Central Europe. The second claimant to the 3 thrones was Jan Zápolya, the voivode of Transylvania. As a kind of Hungarian border lord, He enjoyed the support of the Hungarian aristocracy, and they nominated him to succeed Louis II. Furthermore, he was related to the Polish high aristocracy, a kingdom where a separate branch of the Jagiellon dynasty ruled over both the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Although old King Sigismund I of Poland did not intend to pursue his own claim to the thrones of Hungary, Croatia and Bohemia, he could not ignore the threat of Habsburg expansion. To check their growing power, he threw his support behind John Zápolyó, Ferdinand's rival. What followed was a brutal war of succession that raged in one form or another until Zápolyó's death in 1540, a struggle that would reshape the balance of power in Central Europe. This is where Elizabeth comes into the picture. To secure his claim, Ferdinand knew he had to strike a compromise with Poland. The Jagiellon dynasty had no desire to rule Hungary themselves, but they watched uneasily as the Habsburg Empire, which included the Spanish branch that stretched from Spain to the Americas, grew ever more powerful. Although Poland was a strong power in the 16th century, it did not want the Habsburgs extending their tentacles further eastwards into Bohemia and Hungary. At the very least, they wanted to neutralize them and make an alliance if Ferdinand was to secure Hungary and Bohemia. Ferdinand's diplomats soon opened talks with the Polish court, proposing a marriage alliance centered on young Elizabeth. The union would reassure the Jagiellons that once the Habsburgs secured the thrones of Bohemia and Hungary, they would not push further into Polish lands. The plan was simple. Elizabeth would marry the young King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania, Sigismund II Augustus. Though still a child, Sigismund had been made co-ruler alongside his aging father in 1529. Marriage negotiations began the following year in 1530, uniting Ferdinand's eldest daughter with the Polish crown. A formal treaty was signed that November, but Elizabeth was only 4 years old. The agreement stated that the wedding would wait until she turned 7, pending papal dispensation, necessary not only because of her age, but also because the pair were first cousins once removed. In time, the plan was revised. The marriage would be postponed until the early 1540s, when Elizabeth had reached a more suitable age. After years of delicate negotiations, Elizabeth finally departed Vienna in April 1543, at just 16 years old. 2 weeks later, she arrived in Krakow, where she met for the first time the man to whom she had been betrothed for 13 years, Sigismund II Augustus, now 22. That very day, inside the grandeur of Wawel Cathedral, the two were married. Elizabeth was now crowned Grand Duchess of Lithuania and Queen of Poland, sealing a long-awaited political alliance. For the next 2 weeks, Krakow erupted in celebration, festivals, feasts and fireworks, marking what many hoped would be the dawn of lasting peace between Poland and Austria. But beneath the splendour and song, a darker story was beginning, one that would soon turn this royal union into a tragedy. After the celebrations finished and reality kicked in, Elizabeth's life in Krakow turned into a nightmare. Her health had deteriorated during the trip to Poland, and she began experiencing a growing number of seizures. Her marital situation was even worse though. One of the reasons the marriage was delayed until 1543 was the fierce opposition of Sigismund's mother, Bona Sforza. She was an Italian noblewoman of the House of Sforza that had ruled the Duchy of Milan since the middle of the 15th century. Bona was a sharp and formidable presence at the Polish court, and was determined to block Habsburg expansion. Because of this, she had fought the match at every turn, and once Elizabeth finally arrived, she made her new daughter-in-law's life miserable. For instance, even after the wedding, she continued to challenge the terms of the marriage contract and dowry. Elizabeth, meanwhile, was a young and timid woman, and was daunted by her mother-in-law's attitude. But there were even deeper troubles behind the palace walls. Sigismund had little affection for his young bride, and he didn't even consider Elizabeth attractive, which is why he continued to keep several mistresses, even seeing them openly after their marriage. Far from home, Elizabeth was left isolated in a foreign court, accompanied only by a small retinue of Austrians. She was surrounded by a hostile mother-in-law and a husband who viewed her as little more than a diplomatic pawn in the power games of Central Europe. So maybe it was inevitable that her health continued to go downhill. Courtiers reported that her seizures had grown more frequently, while darker rumours spread that old Queen Bona was poisoning her, though no evidence of poison was ever found. Her difficult circumstances drew sympathy from many, and the Polish nobility generally admired her grace and gentleness. Yet even their goodwill could not change her fate. Young Elizabeth seemed doomed from the moment she set foot in Poland. In the mid-1540s, a wave of plague swept across Eastern Europe, and the royal family took the only preventative measure available at the time. They fled from the city and went into the countryside. For a time, Sigismund headed off to Vilnius, the capital of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, with his favourite mistress, Barbara Radziwiłł. Meanwhile, Elizabeth toured Poland with her mother-in-law and father-in-law. Sigismund I, like others, was sympathetic towards Elizabeth's situation, but he was an aged and feeble man in his late 70s by that time and could do little to help her. Eventually, Elizabeth was reunited with her husband in Vilnius, and he attempted to make it appear as though all was well in the new marriage for the sake of diplomatic niceties with the Habsburgs, even though this was not the case. In the city, things deteriorated sharply again. Elizabeth's seizures became more and more frequent, and were now having a serious impact on her overall health. By the early summer of 1545, it was clear that she was in a crisis. Desperate, her parents were written to in Austria, and their doctors hastened to her side, but it was far too late. On June 15, 1545 in Vilnius, the young queen succumbed to her illness at just 18, 3 weeks shy of her 19th birthday. The court was plunged into mourning, and she was laid to rest in Vilnius Cathedral 9 days later. Sigismund II Augustus would rule Poland until 1572, overseeing the formal union of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. After a brief second marriage to his mistress, he eventually married one of Elizabeth's younger sisters, Catherine of Austria, in 1553. In the end, though, none of Sigismund's 3 marriages produced children, and when he died in 1572, the Polish crown temporarily passed to the French royal house of Valois. In 1575, his sister Anna Jagiellon ascended to the throne as the last of her line, after which the House of Vasa took the Polish-Lithuanian crown. So, all the careful diplomatic scheming of the Polish crown had ultimately been for nothing. Thank you so much everyone for watching this video on these princess tales. I hope you found them interesting, and a special thanks to all of my channel members who you can see on screen now, who get perks like early access, extra content, and special posts, as well as more things coming in the future. If you have any suggestions, let me know down below in the comments, and I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me as always, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.